I'm Spencer Bailey. This is Time Sensitive. Hey everyone, in case you missed it, we've launched a new membership program at The Slowdown, which at just $100 a year provides access to our slate of new member-only newsletters, in-depth stories, immersive interviews, curated recommendations, and exclusive event invitations. If you'd like to learn more, go to slowdown.tv/subscribe. That's slowdown.tv/subscribe. On this week's episode, I speak with Dr. Jessica B. Harris. If you saw the Netflix docuseries High on the Hog, you may recognize her name. She is the author of the book on which the show is based and takes its name, and in the first episode, she joins the show's host, Stephen Satterfield, as they walk through Dantokpa Market in Benin. One of the world's foremost historians, scholars, journalists, writers, and thinkers when it comes to food, and particularly to African-American cooking, Jessica is known as the Grand Dame of African-American cookbooks. Over the past 40 years, she has published 12 books documenting the foods and foodways of the African diaspora, including Iron Pots and Wooden Spoons, Africa's Gifts to New World Cooking, The Welcome Table, African American Heritage Cooking, and High on the Hog. In 2020, Jessica received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the James Beard Foundation. Professor Emerita at Queens College, Jessica was an English professor there for 50 years until her retirement. And as a journalist, she has served as the travel editor at Essence from 1977 to 1980, and as the restaurant reviewer at The Village Voice from 1995 to 2001. This conversation was incredibly special. It's rare to say I was sitting with a living legend, but in the case of Dr. Harris, it's absolutely true. Her life has included deep friendships with Maya Angelou, James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, and Nina Simone. And after learning about her dynamic path, it's easy to see her within that lineage. She is a bridge to those incredible culture-defining figures and to worlds far beyond them. Before we get into the episode, I'd first like to thank our Season 7 presenting sponsor, the Maison Van Cleef & Arpels, which this year is working with the American Museum of Natural History in New York to present the exhibition Garden of Green, Exquisite Jewelry by Van Cleef & Arpels at the museum's Mignone Hall of Gems and Minerals. On view through January 2024, Garden of Green will showcase 44 creations from the French high jewelry house, 32 of which will be on view in the U.S. for the first time. Creating a lush garden of jewelry, this impressive array of precious and ornamental green stones will form a dazzling journey that celebrates the beauty of gardens and nature. One area of the exhibition space will highlight a diversity of greenstones. Another will concentrate on particular materials such as jade, chrysoprase, and malachite. And a third will display a selection of majestic creations set with emeralds. You can learn more at www.amnh.org/exhibitions. That's www.amnh.org/exhibitions. And now, here's my conversation with Jessica. Hi, Dr. Harris. Welcome to Time Sensitive.
Well, thank you. Lovely to be here.
I thought we'd start today's conversation on postcards.
Oh, okay.
Particularly the postcard collection you've amassed over decades, 60 years now, from what I understand.
Amassed is a good word. Yeah, it's a mass. It's a mass.
And 1963, if I have my facts right, the summer of 63 is when you first got into postcards or interested in them on your first trip to Europe.
I guess so. I probably have written that. Yes, I'm sure that was true. But there are postcards and postcards. And the ones that I was interested in 63 are the ones that I started to collect in 63 that I certainly no longer have, were just basically your standard European views, including the now X-rated Michelangelo's David. So it was a very different kind of postcard collecting from the postcard collecting that I think I started more or less than in the early 70s. I'm not even sure of the timing when I started collecting antiquarian postcards, which is a whole different kind of thing.
Yeah, and that was really coming out of a visit you had made to a bookstore in Dakar in 1973, maybe 72.
Oh, that's good. I was close. Close.
While working on your doctoral dissertation, which maybe we'll get to, is about French-speaking theater of Senegal. Could you share a bit about what you discovered on this trip in that bookstore? What were these postcards that so captured your imagination?
Well, actually, I had been taken to the postcard by, let me see if I can get her name right, Carrie Sembène. And Carrie Sembène was, at that point in time, the wife of Ousmane Sembène, the Senegalese, cineast that everyone knows. And she was kind of a lover of antiques. This was actually not a postcard shop, but an antique shop. And it had all sorts of things in it. I am, as defined by one friend, a stuffologist. I like stuff. So I think I got a glorious wooden bowl. It was probably a bowl for food, but I used it as a salad bowl. And then a friend of mine actually, she was briefly interim head of the Smithsonian Museum of African Art, at one point said, "Oh my God, Jessica, this bowl is really gorgeous because there aren't trees big enough to make these bowls anymore." Or there are very few, so the bowl is kind of rare. But with all of that, there were bowls, there were the kind of dresses that were called goréennes that were just beautifully hand-cut. It's a kind of particular lace that's called Richelieu in Brazil. I don't know what it's called in France, but it's cut work. And so you cut a hole out of the fabric and then you embroider around the hole and you end up with lace. And there were dresses made out of this, which Carrie wore. And then in, I think, a little tray of something, there were maybe 25 postcards. But they were postcards of old Dakar. Postcards of the Dakar that had, gone before, deeply in the colonial period. And I was captivated. I subsequently discovered that there was a man, and I think his name was Michel Renaudot, who had collected those postcards and who had actually produced a book on them of Old Dakar. And I, of course, promptly bought the book. And postcards had been kind of a thing for him, and certainly then became a thing for me. What I liked about the cards was that they captured a moment in time. And, that sort of... we use the word cliché in English one way, but in French, cliché means just like a snapshot. So they were snapshots of time, of different places in time, different things, and they were extraordinary. So I ended up illustrating my doctoral dissertation with cards of one sort or the other, and to talk about what Dakar was like in its historical period, but equally what it became as we got into the period that I was really writing about, which was the period of the Théâtre Daniel Serrano and Maurice Sonar Senghor and all of that.
And it seems to me that what's also special about these postcards is they're one of the rare sort of media where images of this time is actually still around, still depicted, that hadn't been lost to time.
I think that's true. Yeah. I mean, because they are pretty much before moving pictures or just as moving pictures are beginning to move. And so you've got a real sense of place, but because they're often people in the cards and in the ones that I collected, while I have a lot that are just, vistas and panoramas and views, I have quite a few that are faces. And you wonder, like, who did this little boy grow up to be? Or wow, I wonder what this person would think if they were brought back to Dakar now. On the way over here, I was scrolling through, the 8 million emails that you don't want to look at, but that are there, and found one from an organization that I'm kind of affiliated with very tangentially in Dakar called RAW, and don't ask me what it stands for. But they were talking with two architects, two young Senegalese women architects, and somewhere just casually in the reading of the thing, I read that the Marché Sandaga had been demolished in 2020. I didn't know that. It's like, oh my God. So that's gone. And it was very much a part of the life of Dakar when I was there in the 70s and 80s, arguably into the 90s, but more in the 70s and 80s. It's now probably only captured, certainly in people's memories, and because we are in the 21st century in 2020, everybody had a phone with a video camera on it as well as a still camera. So people probably have images of it being destroyed. But to go all the way back, you really have to go to those postcards. So you've got all of that kind of march of time in a very different way with cards.
Pausing on this trip for a second, the first trip to Dakar in West Africa, could you share a bit about your memories of it? And also, do you have any potent food memories from that particular trip?
Oh, goodness. Well, my first trip to West Africa, I'm pretty sure it was 1972. And I was scheduled to go with a girlfriend who, as girlfriends do on occasion, backed out at the last minute. And I certainly had no intention of going on my own if I could avoid it. And my mother, who was always game, said she'd go. So it was very interesting because I ended up with my first impressions of the continent being multi-generational, if you will. I had her thoughts and my thoughts. And so we went together. We stayed, I'm trying to think of where we stayed. I think we initially stayed out at Ngor, which is on the outskirts of town. And then, for one reason or another, moved into the Hôtel de la Croix du Sud, which was at that point the big hotel in Dakar. And it was interesting because Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who wrote Le Petit Prince, The Little Prince, had actually stopped at the Hôtel de la Croix du Sud when he was a pilot. And it was one of the places where pilots stayed on their way for the Dakar-Rio run. And so it was an old grand colonial hotel with a really good French restaurant and all kinds of things like that. So that was one aspect of Dakar. The other thing was, when I went to Dakar, I spoke fluent French. Now, there was certainly a community of African-American expats. Carrie Semben was one of them. Elaine Keita, Elaine Charles was one of them, and a variety of French expats in Dakar at that point in time. But most of them were fluent in French in a different way. I don't know that they had been French majors. I'm not vaunting my French or anything, but for some reason, and it may have been the fact that it was multi-generational, a lot of the Senegalese took to us, that is to say, my mother and myself. And so we got invited into households. And that was a very different Dakar from the Croix du Sud or the Ngor, because we were able to really see people with themselves, as themselves, and for themselves. And so that was kind of fun and kind of unusual. And this was all taking place, as I like to say, BR, which means before roots. Alex Haley's grand and groundbreaking book, Roots, I think was published, if I'm not mistaken, in 76.
Yeah.
And I think that the TV miniseries came out in 77 or 78. And at that point in time, there was a company called International Weekends that was doing what were in the travel trade called back-to-back charters. So a plane would take a load over to Dakar of people, tourists from the States, and then that same plane, after resting and refueling and getting a new crew on, would then take the previous week's people back. And so those back-to-back charters basically changed the view, changed the presence of African Americans and African American tourists in Senegal. So when I say BR, this is when African American tourists were few and far between, and fully fluent in French African American tourists, as opposed to expats, even less so. So we were kind of, unicorns in Dakar, and very fortunate unicorns in that we got to meet people and see people and, experience a Dakar that post-Roots forever changed.
Were the people who invited you in to spend time with them, obviously I imagine meals were involved?
In many cases, meals were involved. If I was going to someone's home or with mom, always meals were involved. And so that was kind of extraordinary. I mean, one of the people that I remember, I now in retrospect know he was probably a griot. He was not particularly highly placed. I think worked in the theater and just said, you must come. And so we went. And it was a real traditional Senegalese meal. We sat on a lovely mat on the floor and ate out of a communal bowl and washed hands and did all of the various rituals that are involved in sharing a meal in traditional style in Senegal at that point in time. We were each given big, a soup spoon because they kind of knew we were Americans and not really up on eating with our hands, and shared a meal, and that is something I will never forget.
This trip seems so catalytic, and I'm sure it will come back throughout our conversation.
It may.
Your postcard collection, though, just to go back to that, generally speaking, you've grown it and split it up into these sort of 6 categories. Or as it's grown, I suppose you've focused on these 6 categories.
Well, it's not even that. It's like I keep them in shoeboxes. And so they had to be sort of categorized to go in the shoeboxes. So it wasn't really thoughtfully done in that sense. It was just, I seem to have a lot of cards about this. Well, let's call this a collection,
Of all of your collections, within the bigger collection, which one stands out to you as your favorite, or the one that you that moves you the most, I suppose?
Oh, I don't know. And we've talked about Senegal a lot, but my postcard collection extends way beyond Senegal. And I think possibly some of my favorites within the range of them are the ones that they call like arts et métiers, the arts and the jobs, basically. And there is a series, I don't have the whole series, but there is a series of cards about vendors from Guadeloupe. And I'm not sure if it's Guadeloupe and Martinique or just Guadeloupe, but where they are probably studio posed. I'm not sure that they were snapshots per se. I think they may have been photographed in a studio, but they are just the most extraordinarily beautifully composed images that can be used on so many levels. I mean, because they are vendors, many of them are street vendors. So there's one of an ice cream maker, which works on the level of food, because also on the level of tools. You see her old ice cream machine, the old crank kind. So technology is in it. You see how the ice cream was served, so food is in it. You see what she has on and what the young person who's buying the ice cream from her has. So you get not only the idea of dress, but you also get the idea of class, because she is a working woman and the person who is buying the ice cream, I think, and I'm not really sure, and it's different for different postcards, might have been a person of a different class, although they're both Guadeloupean, African descendant Guadeloupeans, so dressed slightly differently. You get all of that in one snap, in one moment in time, and that's kind of extraordinary. And that's what I love about postcards.
I learned a new word while researching for this interview, which was deltiologist.
Yeah. I learned that too. It's like a collector of postcards. Yeah.
Do you view your life as a deltiologist in some ways as a jumping off point for your career as a journalist and then food writer? And I'm asking this because it seems like there is a direct link. And do you see this link from the postcards to your cookbooks that would come beginning in 1985 with Hot Stuff?
Well, I mean, I think the postcards, the actual collecting of the postcards in earnest, was an outshoot of the cookbooks. It was the egg before the chicken, in that sense, not the chicken before the egg. The postcards were not a propeller of the cookbooks in any way, but the growth of the collection came as a result of the writing of the books, because I think in 95, I wrote a book called The Welcome Table. And I wanted to illustrate it with sort of antiquarian illustrations. I think it is the earliest of the books that was actually illustrated. So Hot Stuff, Iron Pots and Wooden Spoons, what's the next one? Sky Juice and Flying Fish and Tasting Brazil are not illustrated. They are cookbooks as cookbooks were written back then, recipe, head notes, and whatever marginalia or other stuff you want to have written, but with no images. The Welcome Table is the first one to use images, and I wanted to, because I had that postcard experience, illustrate it with antiquarian images. And in order to make sure that the rights were all done correctly and everything else, I pretty much went through Bettman Archive to rent the use of the images. And then it came to me in a massive and major epiphany that owning them, because they were in public domain, meant I could use them. And that's when I started going, oh, I can buy some postcards now. And so that's kind of how many of the subsequent books got illustrated. So the Africa Cookbook and Beyond Gumbo and the subsequent books that are illustrated with antiquarian images, I own the images, and that sort of blew the collection up another way. I mean, from doing a book called Rum Drinks, I have a collection of rum labels, of old rum labels and old rum postcards and everything from strange TWA ads when, fly to Cuba and bathe in Bacardi, kind of thing. So all of that kind of stuff came as a part of the collection as a result of that.
And eventually became a book on your postcard collection.
Well, and then there was eventually a book on the postcard collection itself, which has a very simple title. What is it? Vintage Postcards from the African World or something like that. But the subtitle is what I like, or what I absolutely love, which was in my head the title of the book, In the Dignity of Their Work and the Joy of Their Play. So that's kind of what I collect postcard images of.
Looking back now, so 40 years later, going back to your first book, or nearly 40 years, how do you think about this trajectory since Hot Stuff? I think it is interesting, for example, how you can see a direct line from 1989's Pots and Wooden Spoons to 2011's High on the Hog.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It is a straight line. It is not a curvy line. In fact, I begin, and I'm not going to be able to quote it verbatim, but I begin Iron Pots and Wooden Spoons by saying, that there is a line, an imagined sinuous curve, and it starts in the buff-colored shores of Senegal and goes down, blah, 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 crosses the Atlantic into Brazil, comes all the way up through the Caribbean, into New Orleans, and then into the barrios and, urban centers of the North. And basically all I have done in those subsequent years is trace that line. So all of the other books are a result of that line, of that trajectory. So that's what it is.
I'm guessing you never imagined, though, just a decade after publishing High on the Hog, that it would become a Netflix series, in turn also a New York Times bestseller.
The bestseller was, I think, as much or more a surprise than the Netflix. They were all just sort of, I'm gobsmacked. I remain gobsmacked. It has upended and changed my life in a lot of ways. I am massively grateful and somewhat bemused and just excited about everything that it has done.
Yeah, I wanted to ask that because taking a sort of 30,000-foot view, in what ways have you seen this conversation around African-American cuisine, cooking, and our broader understandings of it shift? And how do you view your role within that?
I don't know that I view my role within that. I think it is probably a good idea for me to not view my role in that.
Fair.
But I've been doing this for a long, long time. I don't know that I am, in fact, I do know I am not the only person who started out doing this when I started out doing this. There was an African, I've forgotten, I don't think it was called an African diaspora, but there was an African sort of diaspora cookbook. There were a couple of African-American cookbooks that looked into food history. But for some reason, I seem to be prolific. I've probably written more, and this is being said very guardedly because it is coming without any arrogance or parti prise about it. It's just about putting words on paper. I think I may have done more of that than the people who started out with me, which is not to say I think I've done it better. I've just done more of it. And so as a result, things have happened, have accreted, if you will, around the number of books that other folks may not have had the chance to get or the ability to get. I'm also blessed with a questing mind and an ability with language. And so I think that I am really very, very fortunate in that I can make connections with people in the various places that I write about because of that ability, the linguistic one. I may not say it well, and I may not have 5 sentences to go before it or after it, but I can usually connect with somebody in a market. And I think that creates another kind of thing. And I love markets. And as I said, when I was talking about being in Senegal, BR, or not even Senegal, because I was with my mother in Senegal in the Ivory Coast when it was still known as the Ivory Coast before it became the Côte d'Ivoire in English, French, or whatever other language you might speak. Ghana briefly, and Benin. And so being in those places, and note carefully that I said Ghana briefly because Ghana was English speaking. And some of my ability to connect with people came from the fact that I was French speaking. There were plenty of English speaking people who could go to English speaking places and connect with people. But the fact that I could speak French made the French-speaking places another kind of special for me. And I also, I was a French major. I lived with a French family in France. I have a graduate degree from a French university. And so if I was dealing with the intelligentsia of those places, or for that matter, with the artists from those places, we had common currency in terms of some of the cultural things. I mean, I knew about Voltaire. I knew about Baudelaire. I knew about Picasso. I could talk to people who might have studied in France, because at that point in time, certainly in the French-speaking countries, people who would have been my age would have had to finish their, university education in France. So that's a whole nother thing that made for a connection.
Do you view some of what you do as an act of translation?
No, not necessarily, because I don't know that I'm translating it. I'm not sure. I think in some ways I'm always translating, because I find myself even in English at some points where it's like, I can't say that in English. I got to say it in French. Because that's just, there are things you can say in English and there are things you can say in French. And it's not always the same. Sometimes the nuance is lost in one language or the other as you go back and forth. Or you're making accommodations to render the English or the French in a way. So it's interesting.
In High on the Hog, the book, you write, the cooking of Africa has yet to have its moment on the foodie radar. This was 2011. So I was wondering, do you think it's changed since you wrote that? How would you view the past dozen years?
Oh, I think the past dozen years have been somewhat transformational, but it's not even the past dozen years as much as it is possibly the past 4 years or 5 years. What people think of and know about African American food, or knew about African American food before COVID and before George Floyd, may he rest in peace, and what people know and who's writing and how they're writing and what they're writing about and the kind of opportunities that have opened are completely different. And that is a good thing.
Hey everyone, taking a quick break here to tell you a little bit about our Season 7 presenting sponsor, the Maison Van Cleef & Arpels, which this year is working with the American Museum of Natural History in New York to present the exhibition Garden of Green, Exquisite Jewelry by Van Cleef & Arpels at the museum's Mignone Hall of Gems and Minerals. On view through January 2024, Garden of Green will showcase 44 creations from the French high jewelry house, 32 of which will be on view in the U.S. for the first time. Creating a lush garden of jewelry, this impressive array of precious and ornamental greenstones will form a dazzling journey that celebrates the beauty of gardens and nature. To learn more, visit www.amnh.org/exhibitions. That's www.amnh.org/exhibitions. And now, back to the episode. I did want to bring up your work here as a curator as well.
I seem to have done an awful lot of stuff.
Yeah, I mean,
but I guess
you curated
that's
this
function of being old. Yeah.
You curated this excellent show, African American Making the Nation's Table, that had the ebony test kitchen.
Mm-hmm. Which is now going to the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture.
Which I also wanted to bring up because you've worked with them in a number of sort of advisory and different roles, from their culinary exhibition to the cafeteria menu. So I think it's worth pointing out your work does extend beyond the page and the screen.
Oh, well, yeah. And it's actually in real time, in a way. I am also working with the New York Botanical Garden. And it's a 3-year project on an African American garden. Last year, On Juneteenth weekend, it opened with, last year, when I say last year, I'm saying 2022. On Juneteenth weekend, it opened as an African-American garden in the southern United States sense of African-American. This year, on Juneteenth weekend, 2023, it is opening as an African-American garden in the Caribbean iteration. So it's got 140 plants from the Caribbean world that will be in the garden. So that's been another kind of valent, if you will, of the curation in another kind of funny, wonderful way. And I'm working with the Metropolitan Museum of Art on a dinner that I will not say any more about.
Last night I rewatched High on the Hog, the Netflix series. And it features you with the host, Steven Satterfield.
That's just the first episode.
Yep, just the first episode, but walking through this incredible market in Benin, the Dantokba market, which is one of the largest open-air markets in Western Africa, and you've called it the mother of all African markets. I was hoping you might speak to your time over the years that you've spent in this market, and also what it felt like for you to be there that particular time with Steven, shining a light on it.
Well, there's a lot of stuff. First of all, I love markets. I, have jokingly said I am never happier than when I am ankle deep in pig swill in a market somewhere. I was a travel writer for many, many years, and there are a variety of travel writers' maxims that one comes up with, but one of them is never wear open shoes on market day. Always wear something that's closed, so when you're in that pig swill, you're not necessarily absorbing the pig swill. But with all of that, I at one point wanted to do a book called Markets Around the World, but somebody, I think, beat me to that one, and I'm still about it. But anyhow, the market that I referenced earlier, the Sandaga market in Senegal. In Dakar, there were 3 main markets when I first started going to Dakar. Sandaga, which was the kind of general one, and it had everything from fabric to jewelry. There was a jeweler's section. There was certainly a food section, but it wasn't particularly a food market, although there was plenty of food in it. What was the other one? Kermel, which was certainly kind of a little bit more sanitized. It was the European market, the market where the expats would go shop, where that happened. And there were wonderful flower ladies who were the most aggressive women I've ever seen. But that was because people always wanted to take their picture. So they decided, hey, I can charge for the picture as opposed to charging for the flowers. So that was its own little moment. And then Tilen, which was the real market in the area of town in which people lived. And so you had those 3 markets. And so you could see the difference in things and the way things were displayed, the kinds of things that were for sale, the prices, all of the rest of that in that market. Then as I came down the coast, Treichville in Abidjan was an extraordinary market. It seemed to just go on forever and ever and ever. And it was where I would buy things like, because Abidjan is sort of adjacent to the Akan countries, I could buy kente. So the kente that I own, most of it came from Treichville in Abidjan. You could see beauty parlors where women didn't have running water and were just doing washing hair with 2 buckets of water that they brought from a common tap. You had all kinds of fruits and vegetables and things of that sort, and that was the main market for Abidjan. I went to 2 other markets. One was the Marché de Cocody, which was Cocody. Cocody was kind of the bougie area. And so the Marché de Cocody was the bougie market. And then there was Marché du Plateau, which wasn't really a market as much as it was an African art venue. And it was right in the middle of downtown Abidjan, or what was at that point downtown Abidjan. And so by the time I get down to Benin, I'm kind of market savvy, but the dantokpa just blew me out of the water. First of all, what happened at the tokpa was that there is a calendar. I'm not sure if it's Yoruba. It may be Yoruba. It may be Fon or Eve, or I don't think it's Eve. I'm not sure. But there is a 4-day calendar. I think it's 4 days. It's not a 7-day calendar is the point. And on the nth day, whatever that alternance is, there's a grand marché. So there's a larger market. And that thing just extends for miles. You really don't even know what it is and how far it goes. And each little area has its own thing, as you see only a bit of in the documentary. I'm forgetting a market, which is the market of Lomé, Togo. And in the market of Lomé, Togo, and the markets in many cases are the bailiwicks of women. So women entrepreneurs, and Togo particularly noted for its women entrepreneurs because they have a whole group of folks who are known as nanabens, because the market women who work in the market and who you would think could barely afford, go home in chauffeured Mercedes-Benzes because they know exactly what they're doing. They are, in many cases, wholesalers. They have a grand tradition of working in markets. They are just amazing, and they have political power. So to the point where I can't say when or where or actually accurately what country, but I think it was Togo, the market women all lined up and pretty much said, this has to stop. This particular political person had to go. The person went. They have real power. So when you get down to Benin, you are at the kind of, not really summum, but you are still in this world of markets and power. And it is just extraordinary to see, first of all, the commerce, the distances people come. It's hard to understand even how it works, certainly as an American, because you might have an alley with 10 different people selling exactly the same thing. So why do you go to this one and not that one? Well, you go to this one and not that one because this one may be related to somebody you know, or comes from the same village you come from, or speaks the language you speak, or actually has the best produce. So there are all of those little subtleties that somebody who just glances and says, oh, what a lovely market, how picturesque, doesn't get. And that's the part that I love about markets.
You've written the markets of the African continent are timeless. I find this so interesting. I mean, obviously, some of them do in time disappear, but the active ones, could you speak to that timelessness, that sense of the timeless?
Well, I mean, I think the merchandise may not be timeless. The merchandise certainly changes with time, but the bustle, the
aura,
but also the sense of agora, the very Greek sense of this is the place where you come for news. This is the place where you come to be at the center of things. This is the place where you come to find out what's happening, is very present, very real, and very timeless. And so I think that's part of the timelessness of it all, as much perhaps as the layout and the, everybody's selling okra. But how they sell it and what comes around the selling of it is the interesting thing and the important thing and probably the timeless thing.
I'm glad you mentioned okra. I did want to mention that in the scene with Stephen, when you're at the market, you focus, or the series anyway, focuses on 3 particular foods, okra, yams, and rice. I was wondering how you think about these particular foods through a sort of foodways perspective or an across time, a temporal perspective?
Okay, well, let's start with the yams, because I just wrote an article about yams and sweet potatoes. And, we are all very confused in the United States about yams. We call sweet potatoes yams, and it annoys me. And we do a lot of things where we don't really know what we're talking about. The primacy of the true yam, the Scorecea, I'm probably mispronouncing it, species, is very different from the, not species, genus, because it's a genus, not a species. And then Ipomea, or Pomea, which are the sweet potatoes. Yams are old world. Sweet potatoes are new world. They don't look alike. They don't taste alike. They don't have anything in common other than that they are starchy root vegetables. That being said, why do we get the difference? Because for the West Africans from certain zones on the continent, on the West African part, yams are totemic in the real sense of that word. They are representative in some ways of death and resurrection. New yams come from old yam sprouts. Old yams are sprouted to produce new yams. And so you get that never-ending cycle, so that in Ghana, there are yam ceremonies where the harvesting of the first yam basically has religious significance. And that first yam is offered to the ancestors. And you get all of those things that happen with yams. Because of the importance of yams, including an etymological importance where there are varying verbs meaning to taste or to sample or to eat that have the word nyam in some way. And even today in the Gullah Geechee the Gullah Geechee language of the Carolina Low Country or of the Sea Islands, that whole zone that is the Gullah Geechee zone, food for to nyam, food to eat, is a real expression. So that nyam, to eat, it means the same thing in Jamaican, in deep Jamaican patois, food for to nyam, food to eat. So this nyam, yam, nyammy, all of that speaks to the importance of that root vegetable, which is a tropical vegetable. So the enslaved Africans get here, no yams. No way to grow them because they are tropical. What do? This is me. I don't know there's any way to prove it. But I profoundly believe what you do is you take the thing that's closest to it and call it by the thing you know. So sweet potatoes become yams for people of African descent. That then gets conflated again in, I think it's around the 1930s, when in Louisiana they come up with a type of yam that is different. Its skin is smoother. It's not as fibrous, blah, 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 blah. And you notice I said yam, I meant sweet potato. And that sweet potato, they then baptize a Louisiana yam, hopelessly confusing us unto generations. So the idea is, and the confusion doesn't exist anywhere except in the United States, which probably means that climate and lack is what was driving it. Because even in the English of the Caribbean, there is a difference between a yam and a sweet potato, and everybody's clear. It's only in the U.S. And so in the U.S., we can have candied yams and then at dessert have sweet potato pie, and they're both being made out of the same vegetable. So there it is.
With climate change, do you think yams will eventually come to
No. They are being grown commercially in Florida now. Okay. So they're here. They are here, but they are here not traditionally. They're here implanted as another kind of way.
So while we're on it, I did want to stick to okra and rice. I mean, those are two other subjects that I would be fascinated to hear you unpack through this lens. I mean, hearing about yams, I just felt like I went through a time machine and got to travel across time and geographies with you. I feel like that's sort of what this work is, and wondering how you think about okra and rice in that sense.
Well, I'm going to take rice and end with okra because it's in some ways probably the simplest. Most people think of rice and you first think of Asia. Oryza sativa, which is Asian rice, and it's the rice that we basically know. But there is also an Oryza glabirima, and glabirima is a native African rice. And I will say that again because most folks don't understand. A native African rice. It is indigenous to Africa. It is not transplanted sativa. It is African. And so it grows in an area that was sometimes called the grain coast, although whether or not that was for grains of paradise or for the grain that is rice is debatable. But it grows southern Senegal all the way down through and to Liberia, Sierra Leone, around there. And people are noted for their abilities to do this and to grow rice. And it is grown. It is still grown. It has been in some ways, unfortunately, supplanted by sativa, which has easier growing conditions or can grow more easily, but it's still very much there and very much ritually used. It is certainly ancestral rice and rice that is a part of religious tradition. What we forget or don't know or didn't know or don't want to know is just how, I hate the use of the word smart, but how informed European slave traders were. They very much knew about the rice. They very much knew about the expertise of the people growing the rice. And they made a particular point of kidnapping and enslaving those people for their rice growing knowledge. Those people are the people who are the basis of the Gullah Geechee people. Those people are the people on whose backs the wealth of the Carolina colonies was created, because the Carolina colonies were the richest of the British colonies, and it was all based on rice. So that's the rice story. It wasn't glabirima, it was the technology. There may have been, and there probably was glabirima, but that wasn't the rice that was growing. So when people say Carolina gold, they're not talking about glabirima. They're talking about a form of, I believe it's sativa. I'm not positive, but I'm pretty sure it is. So there's that. Okra is simpler. It has multiple uses. It's a thickener. One of the reasons people don't like okra is because it's slimy. Or my favorite okra word, it's mucilaginous. And so the mucilaginous pod enables a thin soup to become a thick soup. It has qualities that enable it to thicken things. And as such was valuable and versatile and something that was much to be desired. It comes, as does the rice, as don't the yams, in the bellies of slave ships. There are accounts about actually yams were on board. They just weren't transplanted per se. But that's kind of how it happened. Okra comes into the United States probably through the Caribbean. But remember, there was certainly a point in U.S. history, and we don't talk about this point very much, where there were simply the northern colonies and the Caribbean colonies, and everybody was a colony of I'm not sure it was even Great Britain, of England at that point. So there it is.
Hearing this, I did want to bring up this present moment because I think it's worth stating how vital this moment in American history is, in the sense that, particularly African American history, because we're now having this last generation of people who are in their 90s who can remember their grandparents who may have been enslaved as children.
Possibly.
Do you see this as a pivotal moment in history? This sort of generational shift?
Oh, absolutely. I think that that's a generational shift with every generation. I mean, we may be, and I am not sure what those numbers are, or those, I don't know how it goes. In my family, my mother knew her great-grandfather. No, my mother knew her grandfather, my great-grandfather, and he had been enslaved.
Samuel Philpott.
Yes. You did way too much research. But I say that to say that I'm not sure how many people are around who have that memory. People who were in their 90s were born in
the 30s.
Right.
Yeah.
So if they were born in the 30s and you take a 30-year generation, their parents would have been born in the 1900s, or even arguably the 1890s. And then their grandparents, possibly, but very, very tenuously in the 1860s. So that I don't know that there are many of those folks around. I don't know.
In your own family history, you mentioned your mother knew him. I understand you have a few photographs as well of Samuel. Yeah. How has the story of Samuel been passed down generationally?
I don't know that it has been. I am very fortunate on any number of levels. My mother was one of, 10 children survived to adulthood, I believe. So it's a large family. I don't know. I'm not particularly close to my cousins. The cousin with whom I was closest has unfortunately faded to the veils of dementia. And so I can't ask. But it's interesting to note that he did exist. I know because when I was born, my grandmother, at the behest of my uncle on my father's side of the family, wrote down the family history. My uncle on my father's side wrote down the family history from his side, and my grandmother wrote down the family history from her side. So that's how I know, other than through my mother. But my mother, probably through prompting, through discovering the photographs, which I certainly didn't grow up with, but, all of that. And so just this whole idea that there is this connection, and, a very vivid one, is pretty extraordinary. And then the story about Samuel Philpott is harrowing. There are a few things that are more horrific. His mother was sold south when he was 2 years old. And so, as my grandmother writes it, and she had gone to a Baptist seminary, so she put things in almost biblical terms. Her last words to Samuel Philpott were, "Be a good boy, Sammy." And that was that. But then she goes on to say, he preached, but he did not pastor, meaning that he was probably an itinerant preacher who didn't have a home church. as a result of that, that was his way of being a good boy. It's just that breaks your heart. There's nothing else you can say.
He lived to be over 100, isn't that correct?
He lived to be over 100, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I also wanted to bring up your grandmothers. In High on the Hog, you write, as this book is the direct result of my knowing them, I wrote it as if they'd survived to read it. And I wanted to ask, what is it through the writing of that book you hope to relay to your grandmothers?
Well, I mean, I think that particular quote was more about speaking about language and informality, and I didn't want it to be an academic book. I wanted it to be an approachable book.
Personal.
Well, personal in some levels, but approachable. And approachable in language, approachable in lack of footnotes, approachable on all sorts of levels. And so that's specifically what I meant when I said that, because I've read books that are, dedicated to people's parents and grandparents, and you read the book and, my eyes cross and I have an earned PhD. So, it's like, no. Grandma might have loved knowing you wrote it, but would she have gotten into it? Maybe not. So I wanted to write something that my grandmother, either side, could read and understand.
Feel.
Well, they lived it, so they definitely would feel it.
And you learned to cook early on from your mother. I was hoping you might share a bit about that. You've described her as your secret weapon.
Oh, well, she was. She was very definitely my culinary secret weapon. My mother was actually a trained dietitian. She had an AA Associate of Arts degree in dietetics from Pratt. So I grew up with all of the home ec. There was always a meat and 2 at least vegetables and probably a starch and, some bread, which was probably Wonder Bread, but it was all there. And my mother, if we ran out of Wonder Bread, would go whip up biscuits because she was an extraordinary cook. And unlike most cooks who are either left brain, right brain, either you cook intuitively or you bake well. And at some point when you're really good intuitively, my mother could do both. And she also had an extraordinary palate. I did restaurant reviews for the Village Voice for 6 years. And when I was doing those, she was my favorite dining companion because she could eat and say, I think there's a little cardamom in this, or, this tastes like there's some whatever. And so she just had the most extraordinary palate. She was my secret weapon. And because she came out of home ec and everything, she could say things like, nah, you got that wrong. You don't need this, you need that, and put it this way and make that spin around and do that. And I miss that deeply.
Did you ever imagine food would become your life, your career, the way it has?
In a word, no. No, that's very simple. I can say that. No, not in a lifetime would I have imagined this. I mean, because I'm an intuitive cook. I have a disregard for recipe, which is horrible for someone who sometimes has to write them.
And makes cookbooks.
Well, yeah. But I mean, I don't believe in the primacy of recipe. I mean, I think that cooking has the ability to be more creative than many people make it by locking it into recipe. And I know I've got people who go, oh, but can't you appreciate a beautifully written recipe? It's like, yeah, sure, absolutely. But I can't follow it. I can't follow my own recipes. So there is all of that. It's not a thing for a cookbook person to say, but it's the reality for many cooks and many of them who write cookbooks, So we've come up with this thing where it's a tablespoon or it's a quarter of a teaspoon of salt. But is it sea salt? Is it kosher salt? Is it diamond crystal? Is it Morton's? Because Morton's is a little saltier than diamond crystal. Is it sel de mer? And now you have to get into all of those specificities of the salt to make the recipe work. at that point, why? I'm going to use what I've got in the kitchen. So why should I feel guilty because it calls for, sel de mer from Guérande as opposed to, sel pink Himalayan salt or whatever. So there's all of that.
Before we finish, I did want to touch on the memoir you published a few years ago, My Soul Looks Back. And it gets into this extraordinary period of your life in particular in the 70s and 80s and time you spent with this extraordinary cast of people.
Yep.
Maya Angelou, James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, Nina Simone. Reading the book, it almost felt to me like this this mythical time, if I could say that. I mean, at the very least, it was certainly magical. Is that how you see it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I have been extraordinarily fortunate. I mean, and my introduction into that incredible world, or, the rabbit I was following down the rabbit hole, was a colleague who became a dear friend, boyfriend, large quotation marks, named Samuel Clemens Floyd III. And had it not been for him, I could have lived through that very self-same period and not known any of those folks. So it is the luck of the draw. It is the intensity with which you go into things. It is, I guess, in some ways, just plain karma.
We could have done a whole episode talking about that period of time, but I wanted to keep it for the end because I feel like, in a way, your life is as rich as the lives that they lived. And maybe it's hyperbolic to say, but that's what it feels like, understanding the decades and time you've spent engaged in the way you have. So I guess if there's a question out of that, it's, how do you feel specifically about the time you spent with them, and how do you see it in the context of where you are now?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you. Second of all, I had a major birthday. I turned 75 last month. No, 2 months ago at this point. And had a birthday party at which my youngest friend, well, my oldest friend, the person I had known for the longest because she lived on the block I grew up on, gave a toast. And then my youngest friend, who is an extraordinarily brilliant young man named Yadan Israel, who is probably the youngest senior editor at Simon & Schuster, and for sure probably the youngest Black senior editor in publishing, period, no matter where. Maybe one of the very few Black senior editors, young, old, or otherwise. And Yadan got up and offered a second toast. And Yadan is extraordinarily thoughtful and knows me quite well and met me as a result of the memoir. And he said that the memoir had attracted him and had reached out because what he realized was that I was a kind of link between that generation and his generation, or the then and the now. And quite honestly, I'd never thought about it. I never thought about it one way or the other, but he sort of insisted that that was the role that whether or not I knew I filled. And because Yadan always tells me stuff about me I don't know or see, I believe him.
Researching this, I came across this great New York Times profile of you from 1990 by Nancy Harmon Jenkins. And in it, there's this quote. You say, I like to say I'm American by passport,
Ah.
Senegalese in my heart, Beninoise in my stomach, Bahian in my soul, and I guess maybe French in my head. And within that American by passport phrase, I guess we could include 3 key homes: New York City, Martha's Vineyard, and New Orleans. I was wondering if you might talk a bit about your time in each of these places and also just how you think about this sort of bouillabaisse, I guess we could call it, of place, which includes, Senegal, Benin, and Bahia.
Well, yeah, I think that pretty much still holds true. That was the 90s. Here we are, 40 years later, 30 certainly. And I am still American by passport. I just renewed my passport, so I've got an American passport till they take it away. But I am profoundly American in many ways. Senegalese in my heart. I haven't been to Senegal in quite a while. I do need to get back. But there was just a thread, a string that vibrated at the right tuning fork level. It was, I have not had my DNA done. At some point I might, but one of the reasons that I haven't had it done is because if I'm not descendant from the Senegalese, I'm going to be painfully distressed. But there it is, you're from where you're from. Beninoise in my stomach because I find that the food of Benin, and it's one of the reasons that I suggested that High on the Hog go to Benin, because there were 2 places mentioned in the book, Senegal and Benin, and I said Benin because the food is actually in some ways closer to the food that I grew up eating, the African-American food that I know. And so that was the reason, among multiple others that I won't go into, for choosing Benin. What's the other one? Bahian, in my soul. And that's because I am, and it's the subject that we are not going to get into because it would be a whole nother podcast. I am the first American to be initiated into one of the oldest houses of candomblé in Salvador de Bahia de Todos Santos, better known as Salvador, Brazil. So that's my connection with Bahia. I am a daughter of Casablanca. And there it is.
Jessica, this was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Extra thanks to our Season 7 presenting sponsor, the Maison Van Cleef & Arpels. Van Cleef & Arpels' jewelry is characterized by a distinctive blend of poetry and refinement. With its iconic jewelry collections, it is an invitation to a timeless universe of beauty and harmony. You can discover more at vancleefarpels.com. That's VANCLEEFARPELS.com. And thank you for listening. You can find more episodes of Time Sensitive on our website, timesensitive.fm, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can follow us on Instagram at slowdown.tv. To join the Slowdown's new membership program, which provides access to subscriber-only newsletters, in-depth stories, immersive interviews, curated recommendations, and exclusive event invitations, go to slowdown.tv/subscribe. That's slowdown.tv/subscribe. Our theme music was composed by Billy Martin. This episode was produced by Ramon Broza, Emily Jang, and Johnny Simon.